So in order to do that, we must have both documentation. Along with the documentation, the coding must be there. Such activities and phases are always present in the life cycle independently on the development of the model chosen for the project. In the phase of implementation, we have written a code which can be developed in any of the Python programming languages or any of the programming languages. Once when we understand that the documentation done in one of the project is not at all essential for any other project, we say that it is obsolete. Hello and warm welcome to one and all. It is Dr. Ravi Kumar YB, Department of Computer Science, Vidhyaashram, First Grade College, MYSURU, the Temple of Excellence. In today's session, let me teach you about the software documentation. That is, the documentations at the level of design process, at the level of implementation process, at the level of collecting the requirements of a client. All these things had been already discussed in the previous sessions. Even then, let me explain about the software documentations, the overall software documentation. That is, whether it may be in terms of the software requirements collection, whether it may be in terms of design and analysis, or it may be in terms of integration testing, or at the time of verification and validation, or maybe at the time of development or implementation. All these are the different phases of the software development life cycle, which includes the software documentation. So let me give you the details of it. If that is the case, during the development of a software project, documentation is undoubtedly the activity we all like to do at the least. On the other hand, often programs are simply thrown away and rewritten because they are no longer under control and there is not enough information to understand them. Because if we just write down the programs, or if we just write down the source code in any of the programming language to meet the desired objectives, and if we do not do the documentations related to the coding which we have done, then it is of no use, because sometimes we may throw the things, that is the documentation. Sometimes we may throw the codes which is written to meet the desired objective at later point of time. That should not happen, because the code along with it, the documentation must be there to indicate the functionality of the code written over here. So in order to do that, we must have both documentation. Along with the documentation, the coding must be there. So this summary is an attempt to provide receipts that reduce the pain of producing the minimal amount of documentation, which will help the other people to work on the same project, that is internal documentation, and that will allow somebody outside the project to use the product, that is user documentation. So to summarize this kind of documentation will help the internal documentation, that is for the purpose of reusing the code for any of the project which is required in the future use, so that we can make use of this documentation. Because if any other client who comes for the similar kind of requirements, then obviously we can go for it with the help of the existing project. Based upon the documentation which is done for the coding, we can go ahead with any other projects for reusing the same project for any other projects. That is for the purpose of internal documentation. Similarly, we have this. The process of producing the software is made up of several activities, that is the project management, configuration management, and phases like requirements, design, coding, testing, and all those things. All these are different phases, and the project management, along with that configuration management, are the requirements of a documentation that needs to be completed. Along with that, such activities and phases are always present in the life cycle independently on the development of the model chosen for the project. Whether it may be a model of waterfall model, or it may be a verification and validation model, also called as a V model, or it may be a spiral model, or it may be an incremental model. You may adopt any of these models. That is not a matter here. But the only thing is, when you start developing the project, both software management, also called as a project management, and the configuration management, along with the different phases of the software development lifecycle, will help us to deliver the software in time with a proper details to the client. Figure 1 shows that the waterfall model and the V models, but there are also other models such as iterative and rapid prototyping models. In the next slide, you will see that figure. See here, figure. We have the requirements, that is the phases. The first phase of this is requirements, second one is architectural design, third one is detailed design, fourth one is implementation, also called as a coding, and it also includes the unit testing, that is then integration testing, that is combining all of these modules, then verification and release. So we have these modules. It is approaching in this manner and moving on in this manner. But if you move on to the verification and validation model, you will see that the requirements, alternatively we have the validation and testing, whether the requirements are properly collected, what is the requirement of a client, all those requirements are written over here in the documentation properly, everything is noticed here. Then moving on to the architectural design, we have the integration testing, whether the architecture of a system is properly written or not. Once it is written, whether the integration testing is working according to the architectural design of that is cross-verified. So we have a bi-directional arrows here. So then moving on to the detailed design. Once the detailed design is done, we have to go for a unit testing, because in case of unit testing, every module is tested by the developer so that it is cross-verified whether the detailed design is mapping with the unit testing or not. Once it is done, we will move on to the implementation part. From implementation part to the unit testing, which is done again by the software developer. So this kind of process is called as a V model. So we can compare the waterfall model with V model in this pictorial representation. That the documentation, the purpose of the summary is not to discuss which model is best. Here the purpose is to say that whether waterfall model or V model, both are using, whether it may be any other model. All these models require documentation purpose, but it doesn't mean that which model is best for documentation. That is not the meaning of that, because a documentation is required for various types of models. If that is the case, model is best. Different models suit different organizations or projects. What all these models have in common, and I intend to talk about this here, is that any software product without solid documentation not last long or will cost much more than the expected to maintain. Without documentation, it is not clear to perform the implementation. Once the requirements of a client is not clear, it is not at all possible to proceed with implementation. Once the requirements are complete in the form of documentation, we can go ahead with implementation and come up with suitable software delivery of the code. Without information on the development process, implementation choices like tests, criterias, like test cases, etc. Nothing is clear, and the software project always ends up in an unmanageable mess. The same thing as I told you right now. That is, if the documentation is not properly done, then it is obviously leads to then unmanageable mess of programs. So it is always essential and needed to have the documentation for every project we develop. What can I call this as a solid documentation? The detailed documentation. It is not the production of tons of paper, but the updated and structured amount of information needed. That is the detailed information needed to keep the project under control. We can minimize the budget, that is the amount of time as well as the budget which is required to implement the project. Everything can be minimized if we have a proper documentation. The proper documentation means we must have the detailed information of the requirements of a client. Then we can go ahead with implementation part. So some projects will focus more on some phases and some skip others, but documents must not be produced during the development of a project. During the development of a project, we will refer to the documents which was used for the prior discussion of the software developer with client. That means we will consider only the documents which are prepared while discussing with the client during the time of development, but it is not done at the time of implementation. That means documentation is done and not done at the time of implementation. You can see to it in the V model clearly. Is there any documentation done here? Not at all. Detailed design documents are done, architectural design documents are done, requirements documentation are done. Once it is completed, we will move on to the unit testing document. Then we have integration testing document, validation testing document. All these are different types of documents which is carried out here in this manner. So we have a V model. We will not at all use the documentation in case of implementation, because that is a thought process of a human being and how he is going to approach the problems of the client. So the documentation is not done at the time of development of a project. In figure 2, let me show you the figure 2 here in the next slide. All phases are done by different people, sometimes the same people. If they cover more than one role in the project using different tools to produce different kinds of documents, that again leads to a problem. So kindly look into it. We have the requirements phase, which is the tool he is using, word processor. What is the requirement? User requirements are collected in the form of a word. Case tools, analysis. For analyzing the requirements of a client, he is using the diagrams. Case tools, like for designing the diagrams or requirements of a client, he is using the diagrams. For development purpose, there is no need of it. The code may be written in any of the programming languages, development environment. For testing tools, moving on to the testing tools, we have a test plan reports and then word processor ultimately at the time of documentation, that is user documentation. When it is delivered to the user may refer to the user manual stating that what was the requirement of him and how it has been implemented. Whether all of the requirements are implemented is checked once again by the user. That is the user documentation, which is used by the user given from the company. If that is the case, the figure 1 indicates that the V model wherein the implementation part was not included as a part of documentation, but the unit testing, detailed design, analysis, requirements, and all those things, integration testing, validation testing, everything was done with documentation. Everything was done with documentation, but not with implementation. So the same thing, you can see it here. In the phase of implementation, we have written a code which can be developed in any of the Python programming languages or any of the programming languages. But the thing is, the user is collecting the information in the form of a word processor. Then he is transforming the content, which is in the form of a descriptive manner, into the diagrammatic representation at the time of analysis. And at the time of design, he is writing the diagrams to indicate this is what the client is required in his project. So the diagram is written over here. These diagrams are converted into the form of the coding. Once it is implemented successfully, the test cases are conducted here. We have manual type of testing and automated testing, and we have various types of tools to perform the automated testing. In case of manual testing, the tester must need to the system with possible type of test cases, that is for inputs. Then again, finally, it is documented in the form of a word processor and given to the user. So it is a clear fact that writing documentation is not a fun. It is not for a fun. It is given for the purpose of delivering the software product with clear picture to the client. That means in a software project, 60% of the time is spent to understand and read out. That is 27% plus 33% for existing programs. That is not fixed. Undo and redo. What is the meaning of undo? That means if there is any changes to be incorporated, then we can do that undo. We can undo. What is the meaning of redo? Redo means, as you have already seen, that undo means if you want to change the existing to the previous thing, you can do it. And if you can retain the things back using the redo operations. In the same manner, you can use the existing functionalities, existing documentation for any of the project to be developed. That is the purpose of it. This is often due to the fact that documents supporting the project are inadequate, not detailed enough, or obsolete. Once when we understand that the documentation done in one of the project is not at all essential for any other project, we say that it is obsolete. Suppose if it is adequate enough, then obviously we can make use of this into any other projects. Then if that is the case, component, which are the components? Let me tell you that. Program understanding 27%, requirements analysis 24%, design analysis requires 18% of documentation, implementation requires sometimes 18%, and testing requires 13% of documentation. In all these cases, work is 40%, rework is 33%, so totally 73%. If that is the case, so the person who proposed this method has stated that an investment model for software process improvement that involves technical report, engineering report, that is HP corporate engineering report. So all these are the report that states that 27% of information, 24% of information, 18 and 13% of information are required in different phases of the software development life cycle. So why do we need better documentation? The poor documentation always leads to more expensive project. But if we have a good documentation, that leads to a minimal amount of budget spent on it. So that's why if you see that increases the time not spent in producing new features. Poorly documented products have difficulty in finding users and evolve slowly until they become untouchable. That means we are not going to use that product at all if it is not properly documented and need to be partially rewritten or simply thrown away. That is the meaning of it. A good documentation is the one which helps people to quickly integrate in the project, allow proper project management, because problems are highlighted early at the development, can be controlled adequately in the later or future projects which they get from the clients. Inside the project documentation is the glue between phases and among the people working together at different artifacts but with the same project goal. The quality of the product is something that must be built. It is not something that comes for free and without effort. Please listen to it once again carefully here. A good documentation is one that also saves time along with the budget constraints. The documentation of the early phase of the project requirements and analysis is often neglected, but actually it is very, very important. It is these early phases where correcting wrong choices is much cheaper. That means at the initial phase of the software development, if the documentations are done properly, that leads to a good delivery of software to the client. Otherwise, that leads to an effort wasteful thing to the client. That means the efforts applied onto the development will go in vain. That is the meaning of this. So without documentation, no proper development will be carried out. If you look at this figure 4, analysis cost requires 1%, design 10%, implementation there is a breakdown, that is 100%, then final delivery. So these are the different phases of the software life cycle which requires the documentation. And of course you are observing that there is a 100% in this implementation. That doesn't mean that the implementation or the coding part requires the documentation. Of course the unit testing requires the documentation but not the implementation, because in case of unit testing we will be cross verifying whether the requirements have been met in the project or not. That's why we are making it as 100%. With this I am going to conclude this session. Thank you very much. Thank you one and all, my dear students.